So this morning we're going to keep going in this series that we've been in called Killin' It, where we're looking at toxic stuff in us that keeps us from coming alive, stuff in us that we need to kill. And we've looked at pride, we've looked at anger, we've looked at guilt, and this morning we're going to turn our attention to greed. Now, greed is tricky because it's such a sneaky thing. The truth is, I have never met a greedy person. I've met angry people. I've met people that say, yeah, I definitely got anger issues. And I've met guilty people, met people that say, man, I struggle with guilt all the time. But I have never, ever met someone that says, you know what my problem is? Greed. Man, I am just like incurably greedy. Now, I'll show you what I mean. Okay, if you're here this morning and you're a greedy person, stand up. See? See what I'm... Just kidding. Okay. Look, people go to counselors by the droves over anger and guilt and lots of other stuff. But there are no 12-step recovery programs for like the insufferably greedy. Greedy people don't recognize that they're greedy. You know, unlike anger, greed hides itself behind a veneer of virtue. Greedy people aren't greedy, right? Nobody's greedy. They're just savers, right? Greedy people aren't greedy, they're just good planners. And financial planning is really a good thing, right? See, greed is very difficult to see in the mirror, but we sure as heck see it in other people. You know greedy people, right? Y'all know greedy people? People who talk nonstop about money. People who worry and strategize incessantly about money. People who talk as if they don't have enough or what they have is just enough. People who rarely give freely and joyfully. Like when they give, if they give at all, they give with strings attached. Like we've all seen greed in other people. It's almost impossible to see in ourselves. And I think this is why Jesus comes at us with this stern warning to watch out. In Luke 12:15, Jesus says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Now, that's very strong language. He says, watch out, like be on your guard. Why? Because we're all susceptible to greed. It comes so naturally to us. He says, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Then he gives this abrupt warning and he says, okay, look, do not let your life center around possessions and stuff and materialism. Because the truth is, you can only have one main thing in your life. You can only pursue one thing fully. And according to Jesus, what should that one thing be? Guys, this is a church. That one thing should be God. Okay, all right. So at the heart of greed, see, this great swap takes place. Stuff becomes God, and God becomes an afterthought. And so often, greed is actually fueled by fear. Greedy people have this ability to entertain endless what-if scenarios. Okay, what if we suddenly incurred huge medical expenses? What if I lost my job? What if my car broke down? What if the economy crashed? Behind an endless list of what-ifs is this heart of fear. Fear that God either can't or won't provide for needs. And of course, if God won't, then who will? So greedy people set out to acquire and maintain whatever it is they think they need to feel secure. But like all human appetites, the appetite for security, as I think we all know, can never be fully satisfied. For the greedy, like no amount of savings, no amount of assets, no 401k is ever enough to feel completely secure. So acquiring and hoarding and self-indulgence just continues. And the greedy Christian will often say, they're biblical, so they want to quote scripture on this. They'll often say, but aren't there a couple of verses in Proverbs that encourage us to prepare for the eventualities of life? And there's the challenge right there in identifying greed as a problem, because it's able to camouflage itself as a virtue. So Jesus is strong about it. He says, watch out. Okay, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And then he says, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And we hear that and we think, well, duh. I mean, doesn't everyone know that? I mean, does anyone really believe that their life is equivalent to what they own? And the answer to that is yes and no. No, not everybody knows that. And yes, there really are people that believe that your life is pretty much the sum total of all that you own. And many of us, if we're to be real, many of us are more prone to that belief than we might imagine. So from this warning, Jesus launches into an illustration, a story, a parable. Starting in verse 16, it says, "And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' So he starts this story with this landowner, this wealthy farmer that has this unbelievable harvest. And his good fortune has left him with this difficult dilemma. He has no place to store all the extra stuff from his harvest. So he thinks to himself, what am I going to do with all of my excess? All of the excess that I have as a result of my brilliance and my hard work. The landowner has no place to store his crops, which is like farmer talk for save. He needs a place to hoard his reserves. Now, in an agricultural society, okay, that Jesus is speaking to, something would be immediately obvious. Jesus' listeners would recognize that this man's huge harvest was not simply the result of his brilliance and hard work. Farmers are always, and they know this, farmers are always at the mercy of factors that they can't control. Just a little side note. It's interesting to me that where there's a lot of farming is the Bible Belt of our country. Usually, the greedy man or woman doesn't see the world that way, though. What comes their way, of course, comes because they earned it. And since this landowner believes that he's earned his abundance, he never considers that God might have been involved. And even if he had attributed this windfall to God's blessing, it never occurs to him that the blessing of abundance is for anybody's consumption but his own. And Jesus' point is that God has provided him with the extra, and so the question he should be asking is, Lord, what do you want me to do with the extra? But that's not how greedy people think. And to be honest, to be really honest, that's not my first thought either. Like when I come into a little extra, my first thought is usually, lucky me. And like the landowner in this story, I can always come up with a plan. Man, I can always come up with a plan for the extra. More savings? New purchase? Cool vacation? Like I can always come up with a plan that benefits me. And that's what the landowner decides to do, verses 18 and 19. He gets this windfall. It says, then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, self, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Isn't that the life? That's the American dream right there. This is genius, right? Like, of course, bigger barns. It's perfect. He's going to be set for life. The problem is, according to Jesus, okay, this is not so awesome. This guy is afflicted with a horrific disease, okay, BBS, bigger barn syndrome. And BBS is one of those illnesses. It's like a latent illness that's so hard to detect. Like, because on the surface, all seems well. And this guy's decided to build bigger barns to secure his future. Now he'll have all that he needs for years to come. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Thanks to disciplined planning and opportunistic saving, the kids won't have to care for him in his old age. It's just responsible. It's other-centered thinking. And if the story ended there, we might consider this guy like a role model. But the story doesn't end there. Nobody's story ends there. While it's true that this landowner planned ahead, it turns out that he actually didn't plan ahead far enough. He was right. He did indeed need to secure his future, but not in the way that he thought. He was presuming on years that he actually didn't have coming to him. Just as he overlooked the God factor in evaluating his good fortune, he's overlooking it now in calculating how many years he has left. He assumed that his abundance of stuff assured him an abundance of time. But it turns out that the two don't actually have anything to do with each other. The same day the landowner made a decision to keep everything, he ends up losing it all. So Jesus continues, verse 20. It says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you.'" So just after this guy gets off the phone with the barn renovation company, he gets some bad news. He's going to die sometime in the night. He's about to learn the hard way that life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possessions. He's going to run out of time before he runs out of stuff. And it turns out that this guy is more dependent on God than he realized. It turns out that he's completely dependent on God for his allotment of time. And it's too bad that he didn't see he was equally dependent on God for his allotment of stuff. When God delivers the bad news, he asks a question that's really loaded with implications for all of us. Something we don't like to think about, but it's loaded with implications. Verse 20 says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you.'" Then comes the question, "Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" And the answer to this question, I think, should be obvious. Someone else. Someone else will end up with everything he's stored up. Someone else will end up with everything that he's hoarded for himself. In the end, all of his possessions will be distributed to someone else. Not because he's generous, okay? Because he's dead. And the parable of the rich fool is intended to attract our attention to an obvious, okay, but often overlooked reality. Eventually, everything that we own will be owned by someone else. In the end, it will all be given away anyway. It's not a matter of if someone else will get it. It's just a matter of how and when. Either we'll give it away while we still have time, or it will be taken away when our time runs out. And so Jesus closes this parable with a stern warning. Verse 21, he says, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." And this is Jesus' definition of a greedy person. Person who stores up things for themselves, but isn't rich toward God. Now, being rich toward God is Jesus' talk for being generous toward those that are in need. A greedy person saves carefully or spends wildly, but gives sparingly. And you look at this and you go, okay, but what's the warning that Jesus is trying to convey? I mean, what's he saying will happen to you and me if we don't give? Death? Well, I don't think so, because death is a given. It's already going to happen. So is he saying maybe that it would be unexpected and sudden death? Yeah, I don't think so on that either. Because I know some very generous people that died unexpectedly. On the other hand, there are some very old, greedy people. To the disappointment of their greedy relatives. They just keep right on living. Now, this story is interesting because it reveals to us the sneaky nature of greed. In fact, we can read a story like this and we can think to ourselves, wait, what did this guy do that was so awful? I mean, didn't he do what most rational people would do? I mean, why would Jesus tell a story like this? What exactly is the point? So let me just highlight 3 points that are sort of brought out in this story. Number 1, all that I have is a gift from God. In our culture, we have an interesting phrase about successful people, specifically for successful people that, against the odds, have risen to success out of dire circumstances. We call them self-made. We say he's a self-made man or she's a self-made woman. The point that Jesus is making here is that no one is self-made. The entire idea of being self-made is ludicrous. Saying whenever I have a gift, even if I worked hard for it, it's a gift. And we talked about this a few weeks ago if you were here. To free myself from the delusion that I've earned all I have, that I deserve it, that I did it all myself, I need to remember that I cannot by myself engineer success or wealth. Because behind whatever talents that I have, behind the opportunities that have come my way, behind the people that have supported me all along the way, behind my circumstances, behind all the open doors that I've walked through that have enabled me to have the success, there's always God. No matter how hard or smart I've worked for something, I can't really ever take the credit. All that I have is a gift from God. And so that brings us to the second point from this story. Nothing really belongs to me. In several parables, different stories, Jesus compares us to managers. And the idea is, in those stories, that God is like the owner of it all, and he just is giving us his stuff to manage for a time. And the reality is, when it comes to all of our stuff, our time will run out. Like one day, no matter what you've accrued, someone else is going to get it. Like even the most personal of our stuff is going to go to someone else. Many of you know that over the years, Jen and I have sort of done an extreme makeover on our house. And most of it's been out of necessity, things just absolutely falling apart and needing to do something about it. But over the years, we've kind of transformed it into what we want. Like our yard is laid out the way that we want. And our kitchen is set up kind of the way that we want. Like when we remodeled, we picked out the cabinets and we picked out the countertops and we picked out the flooring. But as I was prepping the message this week, as I was thinking about the story of the rich fool, I was thinking about my house and something hit me. One day, some other family is going to live there. And like on that day, other people will use that kitchen. And they will store their food in my cabinets. And they will make their meals on those countertops. Like even my house isn't mine. And I mean, the truth is it's the bank's anyway. But in the end, you get the point I'm saying. Absolutely nothing is mine. And this truth is something Jesus wants us to come to grips with and see with clarity. We've been blessed by God with stuff to manage for a time on his behalf. And that perspective, if we can truly hold it, changes everything. I mean, question. When you sit down with a financial manager, what's the first question they'll ask you? Say, what are your goals? I mean, if you got a good one, I hope they do. They say, what are your goals? Why? Because they're handling your money. The manager's goals really become irrelevant at that point because you aren't discussing his money. A good money manager will always handle your money with your goals in mind, not his. If your financial planner received a check from you, like with no instructions attached, what would be the appropriate thing for him to do? Like go shopping? I hope not. A good money manager would call you up and he would say, what do you want me to do with these extra assets? After all, okay, it's your money. And with this recognition comes then this feeling of responsibility. And that leads to the third point of this story. Number 3, God has given to me so I can bless others. God's priority for the finances that I'm managing on his behalf is the people that he loves. God wants me to use whatever I have to bless others. Not that I don't enjoy some of it, not that I don't save responsibly, but ultimately it's been given to me to manage, and to manage in such a way, what are his goals financially? To bless people. I'm not supposed to be like a dam where all the blessing backs up. I'm supposed to become like a blessing conduit, like a canal. Like the blessing is supposed to come down and then just flow right on through me. Now, back to the story of this landowner. The point is that God had positioned him to be an immense blessing. He could have been a conduit instead of a dam. And you think of all of the people that would have benefited. I mean, you think about it. This guy is unbelievably wealthy. He's the Bill Gates of his time. Starving people could have been fed. Kids, many, many kids could have had opportunities for education. People with special needs could have been cared for. Hospitals could have been built. Okay, the elderly could have been cared for. I mean, you look at this, you go, the possibilities of what he could have done are staggering, but none of that happened because of his greed. And you know what else never happened? He never experienced the joy that you can only get from giving. Like from being a blessing conduit. He enjoyed his stuff, and that's fine, I guess. But you think about it, he could have seen lives changed. He could have seen communities transformed. He could have been a source of unspeakable joy. And that's one of the most amazing gifts about generosity, is the idea that it's a double blessing. I'm like, the recipient and the giver are both deeply blessed. Have you ever noticed that? When I was finishing grad school, Jen and I saw this play out. Jen was pregnant, and we had no money. And we were living in this old, rundown apartment complex in Linden. And it was super cheap. It was the cheapest we could find. And it was in the ultra low rent district. If Linden had a hood, this was it. And our landlord was the cheapest man that I have ever met. Our toilet broke one day. Just to put this in context, our toilet broke one day, and so Jen called. And our landlord, Carl, said, he's like, oh, shoot, that's a bummer. He says, well, I'm going to be busy for the next 5 days or so, but I should be able to get out there in about a week. So Jen, who's 8 months pregnant, says, a week? You're going to come fix our toilet in a week. Okay, question. Where are you thinking we're going to go to the bathroom between now and then? And Carl, in all seriousness, said, well, have you met the neighbors? Can you imagine that? Oh my gosh. Can you imagine on the neighbor's door every time you have to go to the bathroom? Jen was 8 months pregnant, for crying out loud. What happens when she wakes up at 3 in the morning? Okay? What happens when I have to, number 2? I'm going to go to the neighbors? Really? So thankfully, Jen is a master at handling this kind of stuff, and I've learned so much over the years. And so she says, actually, that's not going to work for me. Sorry, Carl. We actually need to have a working toilet to be able to live here. Okay? And just so you know, you are legally obligated to make sure that we have one. Okay? So I totally understand if you can't get out here right away. Makes sense to me. But what hotel would you like us to move into in the meantime? Because I want to make sure you're okay with whatever it is, since you're going to be footing the bill. And Cheap Carl, our slumlord, said, actually, I can be out tonight. And his replacement toilet was unbelievable. He brought in, I can't really even describe this for you, he brought in this tiny little mini toilet. And I think that it was made for travel trailers and that kind of thing. He must have just gone to Home Depot and found the cheapest one and goes, I'll take that. It wasn't even porcelain. It was just plastic. It was barely bigger than, if you have little kids who are potty trained, it was barely bigger than one of those little things. And I'm serious. And he shows up with this thing, and when he got done installing it, he called me into the bathroom. He's like, isn't this great? And he says, but just so you know, the tank on it's kind of small. I'm like, yeah. He says, and it should be fine with the liquids. but you might need to flush twice with the solids. It was unbelievable. And he left. And I didn't say, I was stunned. I was like, wow. And when you sat on the thing, you were so low that your knees were up like by your head. Okay, so that's the scene. This is where we're living. Jen and I are living in this rundown apartment run by Carl, the slumlord. And as I said, okay, there were only 8 units in the whole place, small little complex. And so we did get to know our neighbors pretty well. Not well enough to use their bathroom, but pretty well. And nobody there was doing well financially. This was a really low rent situation. And it was all that any of us who were living there could afford. If we could afford something better, we would have. And in the middle of this situation, this blessing came raining down to us. Jen was driving at the time this cool little red Mitsubishi Eclipse. And it was honestly, it was a pretty sweet little red sports car. Had a sunroof and it was pretty sweet. But it was older and it had high mileage. But gosh, it was cool. And it was perfect, really. Except that it was a tiny little, like, 2-door sports car, which, by the way, was perfect when she bought it when she was single and 20 years old. It's not so cool with babies and car seats and all of that stuff. So one day, my dad called and he said, hey, your Uncle John is going to buy a new car, and they're not going to give him very much for his Acura Legend on trade-in, and he doesn't want to go through the hassle of listing it and all that. So would you be interested in buying it from him if he gave you a smoking deal and a no-interest loan? And so we did. And we bought it for half of what it was worth, and my uncle gave us this no-interest loan on it, and it was this incredible blessing. I mean, it was incredible. So now we needed to sell Jen's little Eclipse. But Jen came to me one night with an idea, and she said, you know the family at the end of the complex? Like the single dad with the 2 middle school girls? And I knew immediately what she was thinking. The single dad was divorced, and he had these 2 daughters, and he was a construction guy that had struggled and struggled and struggled to find work. And you could tell that he adored his girls, but he couldn't provide much. Like, they couldn't afford to wear the cool clothes. I think they each had like one cool name brand sweatshirt. And both of them, they just wore that thing every day. And their car was the most rundown thing I've ever seen. It was old, and it was loud, and you could hear it just clicking and making all sorts of noise when it would drive by. It was just falling apart. Now, he was a pretty handy guy, so he kept it running the best that he could. Like when he could afford parts, he would go get them. But this thing was falling apart, and a lot of the time it didn't run at all. And when it did, it was, you could tell, it was humiliating. It was embarrassing for him to be driving it. So when Jen said, I think that we should give the Eclipse to that guy and his girls, I was in. I mean, it was a no-brainer. I was like, I'm in. So we went over there, and we knocked on the door, and we said, hey, we were thinking about selling our little red Eclipse, but if you would like it, we'd like to just give it to you. And he just about fell over. Later that day, we went over there and we were signing the title papers. Like, this all happened. And when we were done, he literally cried. So we handed him the keys. And his girls, like, grabbed him. They were just, like, giddy, like, whiny, and just, they couldn't even believe it. They went out and they opened the car and they just sat in it. Sat in the back. And when they had gone outside, he looked at us and he said, that was the nicest thing anyone has ever done for me. And then he went outside and they just went for a drive. And I have to tell you, like, we could have sold that thing. We could have sold that thing, and we could have taken the money, and we could have done whatever with it. But nothing, I'm telling you, nothing would have been, there's nothing we could have done with that money that would have made us, have given us the feeling that we had that day watching that family and watching them drive in and out every day after that. And his head's held high, he's in that car. It was unbelievable. Thank God for my wife who has good ideas, because I would have pocketed the money and done something stupid. In our story, God has blessed this landowner with a sudden windfall. It's unexpected. And he could have been a blessing conduit. He could have known the unspeakable joy of being generous, of being the provider of unthinkable blessings. But it never occurred to him to do anything but consume, to use all of his wealth to finance his own cush life. This last week, I was gathered with a few local pastors, and we were doing some planning and some strategizing, figuring out how our churches could work together. Is that novel? That's pretty cool. And man, I have to tell you, there is really cool stuff on the horizon. Like working together to start some churches locally. Working on a global project together. I mean, it is really cool stuff, but I'm going to save that for another day because that's not why I bring it up. I bring it up because we were gathered together at this house on Big Lake in Mount Vernon. Any of you know where Big Lake is? It's pretty cool little lake. So we're gathered up there from Wednesday afternoon to Thursday afternoon. It's like a 24-hour planning and meeting time. And we met in this house, beautiful house, by the lake. And it's owned by a widow whose husband recently passed away unexpectedly. And they built the house with two separate living spaces. The upstairs where they would live, and the downstairs where they would have guests stay. And this lady and her late husband are very serious, she is and he was, very serious followers of Jesus. And they used their wealth, and I don't know how they accrued their wealth, but they used their wealth to build a vacation home for, get this, other people. And the plan was for them to live upstairs and then to let various pastors and their families use this as a vacation spot. And then her husband died, of course, along the way, which is absolutely heartbreaking, but she still uses this spacious downstairs as like her ministry. So pastors and their families are invited to come and use their place for free. For up to 7 nights, pastors and their families can just come. They can stay there and they can use the dock and the lake and the canoe and the canoes and the paddle board and the paddle boat and all the stuff that's there. And she explained to us, she said, I do this because I've been around pastors my entire life. And I know sometimes they need a vacation, like even if they can't afford it, and often they can't. So we built this to just give them a place to come and get recharged, like enjoy their families, just get away. So she looked at all of us and just said, so you guys, you just call me up and you book this out anytime you want. And then if you want it for a group that's meeting for a ministry purpose of some kind, then I just ask for a small donation because it helps me manage the cost now that my husband is gone. She said, but if it's just you and your family, then I just come and enjoy. Now, guys, that's a couple that looked at their life, they looked at their assets, they looked at all that they had, and they didn't just say, hey, let's take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. They've used their blessings to bless others powerfully. And so I think about her sitting in the upstairs of that house looking out over the lake, and I imagine and wonder if when she sees families with little kids like playing on the dock, I wonder if like she'll feel kind of what we felt when we watched our neighbor. And that's the thing about generosity. It's about doing creative things that are like unique to you and unique to the people that you're blessing. A few years ago, a man in our church came to me and said, hey, my wife and I would like to buy you and your family a YMCA membership. And so he said, you guys can work out. And I was like, what are you saying? He's like, you guys can use the pool. You can play basketball with the kids. Would you let us do that? That would just be such a blessing for us to be able to do that. And I was like, I just want to serve, So You go right ahead. Now, it's been a few years, and you can tell, and I can't tell you what a blessing that's been. I mean, it was so creative. It was just so, they just saw us, saw this, and like we would have never bought that for ourselves, not at that time anyway. But I'll tell you what, man, do we use that? Man, we use it. It's been an incredible thing for our family. And the thing is, you don't have to be like rich to be generous. You just have to be willing to say, what has God given me, and how can I turn it around and use it to bless somebody else? And so I just want to encourage you to think through exactly that this morning. Like, what do you have? What has God given you? And who in your life is in need in some way? Like, what could you possibly do to bless somebody? And I also want to say that many of you are incredibly generous. I mean, you're creative and kind, and you guys, so many of you are doing unbelievable things. I mean, the stories of generosity that I hear and that I see that are going on here are just amazing to me at times. And so I just want you to know, if you've been doing something that blesses someone else with God's stuff, you just need to know God is so happy with that. He's so happy with you. Like, your Father is so pleased. Like, what you're doing brings so much joy to your Father. Last weekend, Jen was out of town in Yakima. She was with Kate at the basketball tournament, and she was on if you were here, you saw the announcement video. And they took Brooklyn with them, and so it was just Cam and I at home, which was trouble. So we did like manly stuff, really manly car stuff. We replaced a blinker light that wasn't working. It's about the full extent of my abilities. So then on Saturday we went shopping, because what else are two men going to do? But we went shopping for Mother's Day. We went shopping for Jen. And so we ended up at Fred Meyer. And Cam had his own money, and he was really excited about that, and he really just wanted to do his own thing. And so we walked into Fred Meyer, and he asked, "Hey, Dad, what do you think I should get for Mom?" And so I said, "Well, from you, she might really like some jewelry, maybe a necklace or something." And he nodded, and he smiled, and he said, "Yeah, cool, yeah." He goes, "How much does jewelry cost?" And so I said, "Well, at Fred Meyer, there's really two ways to go about this. You can kind of go over where the purses are over there, and there's jewelry that's really reasonable. And I mean, it's not real gold, it's not real diamonds, it's not real gems or anything like that, but it's nice. And just so you know, son, you have a mom who appreciates that kind of stuff. She really does like that stuff. And she would love it, especially if it was from you. So like in this area over here, that one there, you could get something for like $10 to $20. And he says, "Well, so what's the other area?" And I said, "Well, if you look over there, see where it says Fred Meyer Jewelers? See where all the glass is and everybody looks rich? You can walk into that domain, and it's real gold, and it's real diamonds, and it's real gems, and it's the real stuff, it's the real deal, but that's like really expensive." So Cam looks at me, and then he kind of looks up again. He's like, "How expensive? Like, give me the range." So I said, I don't know. I mean, it's, you're like maybe on the cheap end with a good deal, you find something on sale, maybe $80, for kind of a lower price necklace, something like that, all the way up to probably, I would imagine, several $1,000s. So he looks at me with this crooked smile, and he says, I've been babysitting and stuff. And so I got funds. He's like, I'm loaded. And he's smiling at me. He's like, so he says, I got enough to go get some of the good stuff. And he was serious. And he wanted to go spend like $140 on a necklace, earrings for mom. Like, instead of buying something for himself, we just walked by the electronics section, and he's like, Dad, did you see the Beats headphones? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, those would be filthy. Well, they look good on me. I'm like, yeah. And then he gets over and he's like, yeah. He says, I got enough to get the good stuff. And he was planning to just like use all of his money to go buy a gift for his mom. Now, that's just a stupid story. I think about it, I get all emotional, which is just ridiculous. But I can't tell you in that moment, as I'm sitting there listening to that going, I cannot tell you how proud I was as a dad. I mean, there was something about that, and it just hit me. So I talked him out of it. I did. I thought Jen would feel bad. Like, if he gives her a $140 necklace or something, and he spent like 5 months worth of earnings, what if she didn't like it? And she's going to be like, I can't take it back. It's $140. It's like, be horrible. It'd be torture, right? So Cam ended up buying her a dress instead. And it's beautiful, actually. But his willingness to be generous, as I watched that happen in him, it moved me. And so many of you, want to bring it back to this, so many of you have been so generous over the years at different times. It's just staggering to me. It's so incredible. And I just want you to know, because if you feel like, God sees that. And your Father in heaven is so pleased with you. And if that's what you're doing, if that's what you've been engaged in, I just want to say to you, keep it up. Keep it up. God cares about that. Being generous is such an incredible thing that God gives us the opportunity to do by blessing us with more than we need. And so I just want to challenge you to think, what has come your way recently that you could turn around and use as a blessing for somebody else?